Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great to be back in Ireland again. This is just a kind of a coming back, because over the last 5 years I've been working with a number of curators and academics. So it's really nice to be back and to have this conversation to continue. Today what I'm going to do is, and once that I've got this kind of siesta slot right after lunch, I'm going to read from a variety of sources. So I'm actually going to quote a few people and engage with a few concepts that we're busy with at SSW. I call this living well in the debatable land. Debatable land, Adventure in the Debatable Land is a short story by Scottish writer Naomi Matheson, part of a book published in 1936 called The Fourth Pig. And I was very interested I was in search of stories because I've been developing this project with Brett Bloom from Temporary Services, and one of the underlying themes in the conversation was the lack of stories and narratives and myths that would help us cope with quite big issues. So once this is called Thinking Through Institutions, I'm going to share some of the thinking behind a project that we're doing in July, which hopes to contribute to something that Brett calls post-oil subjectivities, and also the emerging infrastructure of commons and commoning. So moving on from this idea of the debatable land, I've made a short timeline of events over the last 15 years in Scotland that reinforce this idea of how debatable the land in Scotland is at the moment. So I've called this 432-50, meaning that 432 people in Scotland own 50% of the land. In 2000, in May, there was the abolition of feudal tenure, etc. Scotland Act of Parliament passed to take effect on the 28th of November 2004. Note that the language still in use refers to superiors and vassals. 2003, January, Land Reform Scotland Act passed. The first part created a framework for responsible access to land and inland water. The second part of the Act established the community right to buy. The third part of the Act gives crofting communities the right to buy. 2013, May, Land Reform Review Group appointed by Scottish ministers in 2012 launches an interim report responding to government's ambitions to 1. Enable more people in rural and urban Scotland to have a stake in the ownership, governance, management and use of land, which will lead to a greater diversity of land ownership and ownership types in Scotland. Assist with the acquisition and management of land and also land assets by communities to make stronger, more resilient and independent communities which have an even greater stake in their development. Generate, support, promote and deliver new relationships between land, people, economy and environment in Scotland. Now in 2014, last year in May, the Land Reform Review Group launched the final report with a number of recommendations, I think about 60 recommendations, seen by many as radical. Andy Whiteman, the Scottish land activist, in his blog, he comments some of the recommendations and he says, Chapter 5, Common Good. Further to proposals already include in the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, introduce a statutory definition of common good, a statutory right for communities to manage their own common good fund, and a statutory right for communities in Scotland's boroughs to recover title to their common good assets. Now in June, Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change, delivers the most significant speech on land reform for over 15 years. providing substantial reaction to this report. In August, in a letter to the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, he states that he will require each local authority to establish and maintain a register of its common good property at council level. September, Scottish referendum takes place and no vote wins by 55 to 45%. November, BBC publishes a story with the title Radical Scottish Land Reform Announced. And this is to do with, also in November, the announcement for her programme of government of the newly appointed First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. And in this speech she says, the relationship between the people living in Scotland and the land of Scotland is of fundamental importance. Our aim is to move the debate on land reform from one focused on historic injustices to a modern debate about the current balance of land rights in Scotland and how this can be managed to best deliver for the people of Scotland. Radical and effective land reform aims to ensure the correct balance of land rights, and this can only be achieved through a package of measures taken forward and understood together. In December, Scottish Government publishes a consultation on the future of land reform in Scotland and opens the conversation to the wider public. Now, already this year, 2015, in February, the Duke of Buccleuch, the biggest landowner in the UK, told the Financial Times, "I'm deeply dismayed that this issue has been reopened again. I can understand that there's always going to be some people who object to large-scale land ownership, but we felt that that was dealt with at the time of the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. What is being done challenges the nature of society we live in and property rights. It also, in practical terms, creates deep uncertainty in planning for the future, and I think that's going to be the disadvantage of the rural economy." Now, to finalize this part, also in February, and for the first time in my life, I took part in a government online consultation. And I filled this, this document. Now, why am I telling you this? This is the kind of the backdrop against which we are working at SSW. So this is the conversation that that we're having in terms of managing the land with principles of eco and social justice. So in July, together with Brett Bloom, and I'm going to read from the concept that Brett developed, we're going to organize an 11-day camp called Camp Breakdown. One of the biggest challenges to addressing climate breakdown is the fact that we exist primarily in terms of oil use and the relationships it structures every moment of every day. Constantly relating to the world in this way cauterizes individual and collective petrosubjectivities, a numbing, highly industrialized sense of self and society that can seem impossible to exit. In nearly every articulation of how we deal with climate breakdown, from underground acts of sabotage or the withdrawal into the dark mountains, to mainstream activist efforts and green capital abstractions, we see the violence and logic of oil replicated incessantly. This goes unarticulated and unchallenged. What can we do to start deindustrializing our sense of self while building a culture of survival, healing, and rewilding that's not only for ourselves, but also for our land bases and all the non-human inhabitants, organic and other, that share them with us? We know the power of myth and how dominant ones like the infinite economic growth and technological progress are destroying our planet. How do we mobilize stories and myth for regeneration, healing, and a different kind of relating? Now I'm going to move to a slightly different area, which is liberation theology, and the theologist from Brazil, Leonardo Boff. And he introduces this concept of living well, which is a concept that exists in South America for a long time. But he kind of mulls over it, and And I'm going to read a little bit of one of his blog entries. So he says, living well is not simply identified with our common good, thinking only in function of human beings in society, in an unconscious anthropo and sociocentrism. Living well touches all that exists, nature, with all our different beings, all humans, the search for the equilibrium among all, also with the spirits, with the wise persons, the grandfathers and the grandmothers already gone, with God, that all may coexist in harmony. Live well cannot be imagined without the community, the widest community possible, human, natural, earthy, and cosmic. This category of good living and living well is enshrined in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. The big task of the state is to create the conditions such that living well may be for all beings, not just for humans. He calls it the democracy of the community and of the earth. Now, it differs from other types of democracy because it includes the whole community, nature and Mother Earth. It recognizes the rights of nature, of the animals, the jungles, the waters, as they appear in the new constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. The juridical personhood of all other beings is widened, especially to Mother Earth. By virtue of being living beings, they have an intrinsic value and are carriers of dignity and rights, and for that reason, they are deserving of respect. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this language doesn't work for me at all. Mother Earth, Pachamama, it doesn't, and I do spend a lot of time in South America and Southern Europe and so on. So I started thinking, together with Brett, what kind of languages and myths and stories are we going to tell each other that will allow us to kind of, within a Western context, to have a serious conversation. And I turned to Australian, New Yorkan media theorist Mackenzie Work, forthcoming book, Molecular Red, which is, I think, out in April this year. Anyway, there's a blog post in Verso Books website in which he talks a little bit about the ideas behind the book, and I'm going to quote. Are you still awake, yeah? An unavoidable topic for thinking about future in the 21st century has to be the question of the Anthropocene. Any kind of critical social thought really has to come to terms with the fact that nature is no longer an external or constant given. When the geologists of all people start saying that signs of human meddling are showing up even in the rocks, then it's time to pay attention. The Anthropocene is the name that Paul Crutzen and others give to this period of geological time upon which the planet has entered. The term Anthropocene, as taken up by Paul Crutzen and others in the earth sciences, splices two roots together, anthropos and kainos. Anthropos, that with the face of man, that which looks up. Kainos, that which is not just a new unit of time, but a new quality of form. So as someone who does text rather than things, he says, I'm tempted to reject the term Anthropocene. Naming things ought to be a prerogative of us professional wordsmiths. Again, I'm quoting him. Why accept a name some scientists came up with? And can't we have a more aspirational name? I want a name for what ought to be the kainos, not what is. And in any case, it's too anthropocentric. There's still some low theory work to do to transmit the metaphor of the Anthropocene between domains, but in that process, those labor processes will change it. Rather than interrogate Crutzen's Anthropocene and where did that metaphor come from, perhaps it's better to see it as what it is, a brilliant hack. The Anthropocene introduces the labor point of view, and it's very important, in the broadest possible sense, into geology. So labor into geology. Perhaps the challenge is then to find analogous but different ways to hack other specialized domains of knowledge to orient them to the situation and the tasks at hand. Let's invent new metaphors, says Mackenzie Work. So then I move on to another book called Metaphors We Live By, I think published in 1980 by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And they say, our concepts structure what we perceive, how we get around in the world, and how we relate to other people. Our conceptual system thus plays a central role in defining our realities. everyday realities. If we are right in suggesting that our conceptual system is largely metaphorical, then the way we think, what we experience, and what we do every day is very much a matter of metaphor. But our conceptual system is not something we are normally aware of. They follow on to give an example. And the example of the metaphor is argument is war. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument, and so on. It's important to see we just don't talk about arguments in terms of war. We can actually win or lose arguments. We see the person we are arguing with as an opponent. We attack his positions and defend our own. We gain or lose ground. We plan and use strategies. It is in this sense that the argument is war. It is in this sense the argument is war metaphor is one that we live by in this culture. Imagine a culture where arguments are seen as dance. The participants are seen as performers. So the essence of metaphor, they say, is understanding and experiencing one thing in terms of another. Many of our activities, arguing, solving problems, budgeting time, etc., are metaphorical in nature. The metaphorical concepts that characterize those activities structure our present reality. New metaphors have the power to create new reality. This can begin to happen when we start to comprehend our experience in terms of metaphor, and it becomes a deeper reality when we begin to act in terms of it. If a new metaphor enters the conceptual system that we base our actions on, it will alter that conceptual system and the perceptions and actions that the system gives rise to. Much of cultural change arises from the introduction of new metaphorical concepts and the loss of old ones. For example, the westernization of culture throughout the world is partly a matter of introducing the time is money metaphor into those cultures. The idea that metaphors can create reality goes against most traditional views of metaphor. The reason is that metaphor has traditionally been viewed as a matter of mere language rather than primarily as a means of structuring our conceptual system and the kind of everyday activities we perform. It is reasonable enough to assume words alone don't change reality, but changes in our conceptual system do change what is real for us and affect how we perceive the world and act upon those perceptions. And to finalize this section, still quoting Lakoff and Johnson, most of our metaphors have evolved in our culture over a long period, but many are imposed upon us by people in power. Political leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, advertisers, the media, etc. Strangely enough, artists and poets and stuff doesn't figure in this list. In a culture where the myth of objectivism is very much alive and truth is always absolute truth, the people who get to impose their metaphors on the culture get to define what we consider to be true, absolutely and objectively true. So the importance of the kind of the metaphors that we choose, and for the last 3-4 years we've been working around the idea of the commons. Not doing projects about the commons, not describing the commons, but trying to find ways through which commons are enacted. And it's important to choose a perspective because it's a very, very broad field, as you will know. In this particular case, I decided to bring in the work of Silvia Frederici, Feminism in the Politics of the Commons. So basically the question being, how does the metaphor of the commons translate into a coherent political project? So the neoliberal attempt to subordinate, says Silvia Frederici, the neoliberal attempt to subordinate every form of life and knowledge to the logic of the market has heightened our awareness of the danger of living in a world in which we no longer have access to the seas, trees, animals, and our fellow beings except through the cash nexus. The new enclosures have also made visible a world of communal properties and relations that many had believed to be extinct or had not valued until threatened with privatization. What, for example, constitutes a common, she asks? We have land, water, air commons, digital commons, our acquired entitlements, for instance, social security pensions. These are often described as commons, and so are languages, libraries, and the collective products of past cultures. More generally, the left has not posed the question of how to bring together the many proliferating commons that are being defended, developed, and fought for, so that they can form a cohesive whole and provide the foundation for a new mode of production. It is in this context, says Frederici, that the feminist perspective on the commons is important. It becomes with the realization that, as the primary subjects of reproductive work, historically and in our time, women have depended on access to communal natural resources more than men, and have been most penalized by their privatization, and most committed to their defense. No common is possible unless we refuse to base our life and our production on the suffering of others, unless we refuse to see ourselves as separate from them. Indeed, if commoning has any meaning, it must be the production of ourselves as a common subject. This is how we must understand the slogan, no commons without community. But community has to be intended not as a gated reality, a grouping of people joined by exclusive interests separating them from others, as with communities formed on the basis of religion and ethnicity, but rather as a quality of relations, a principle of cooperation and of responsibility to each other and to the earth, the forests, the seas, and the animals. Whew. I should, yeah. I had 7 coffees. Examples of commons, according to Frederici, and this is us getting really, really practical, and after this I'm going to pretty much wrap up. Urban gardens as a way of to regain control over production, regenerate the environment, and provide substance. These are centers of sociality, knowledge production, and culture and intergenerational exchange. Appropriation of plots in public lands by women to plant corn, beans, and cassava, changing the urban landscape of African cities, breaking down the separation between town and country. In India, the Philippines, and across Latin America, women have replanted trees in degraded forests, joined hands to chase away loggers, made blockades against the mining operations and the construction of dams, and led the revolt against the privatization of water. From Cambodia to Senegal, they formed credit associations that function as money commons. What a metaphor, money commons. As autonomous, self-managed, women-made banking systems that provide cash to individuals purely on a trust basis, an alternative to microcredit. To finalize, I'm going to go back to Brett's text and kind of try to connect this to what we're trying to institute at SSW. This 11-day gathering is for challenging our industrialized sense of self in relation to the ecosystems we inhabit and rely on. It is for researching, debating, and practicing post-oil aesthetics and culture. And it's for entering a shared effort that goes forward and amplifies itself in the places, cities, landscapes, narratives, and congregations we carry it to. Grounding on our search in local struggles to shift our relationships to land, food, culture, climate breakdown, and each other, will be introduced to and develop embodied learning skills to understand how powerful our perceptual, emotional, ideational capacities are beyond the very limited narratives of collapse, survival, daily life that our culture replicates. These practices will open up our thinking and imagination to generate new we will look to prepare for what lies in the deep times ahead, that haze that sits where the Anthropocene is the long past. These activities will be combined with discussions, visiting speakers, and excursions to places that will help focus our efforts and make them resonant well beyond our short time together. We will end the 11 days together with 2 days of planning work that collectively builds up a culture that will develop, that will help us take care of one another and endure the chaos of climate breakdown. Just that. We will work in groups to develop future gatherings at SSW and elsewhere, experiment with new embodied exercises, deepen specific awareness of things encountered during the workshop, and in general, use the momentum we create together as an engine for future activities. Now, I will be sending out an email to the Power Institution and Megs, to whoever is wanting to disseminate this. We'll have some places that people can apply for to go if they are interested. I hope to see some of you guys there. Thanks very much.